Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897, one of the most influential horror novels ever written, was inspired by a real man. And the real man was in almost every measurable way more terrifying than the fictional vampire Stoker created from him. Not because he drank blood, not because he transformed into a bat, not because he rose from a coffin at midnight, but because what he actually did was something considerably more disturbing than any of that. He did it in daylight, he did it publicly, he kept meticulous records of it. He considered it an entirely rational and defensible policy of governance. And the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful military force on earth in the 15th century, an empire that had just conquered Constantinople and was in the process of absorbing everything in its path, developed a specific and documented fear of him that shaped the military history of Eastern Europe for decades. Before we go any further into what Vlad III of Wallachia actually did, I would genuinely appreciate if you hit that subscribe button and leave a like right now, because what comes next is exactly why this channel exists. To understand Vlad the Impaler, you first have to understand the world that produced him, specifically the specific world of 15th century Wallachia, a small principality wedged between the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north, a territory that functioned less as an independent state and more as a permanent buffer zone between two competing powers, each of which wanted Wallachia controlled by someone sympathetic to them, which meant that the princes of Wallachia spent their entire reigns navigating between Ottoman demands and Hungarian demands, while simultaneously managing their own boyar nobility, who had enough wealth and enough connections to both empires to replace any prince they found inconvenient at essentially any time. Vlad was born into this environment in approximately 1428 as the second son of Vlad II, known as Vlad Dracula, meaning Vlad the Dragon, from his membership in the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order founded to defend Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion, and the name Dracula that Bram Stoker would later attach to his fictional vampire was simply the patronymic form of this title, meaning Son of the Dragon, a name that Vlad III used himself in documents and correspondence not as a sinister moniker, but as a straightforward identification of his lineage, which tells you something important about the distance between the historical figure and the fictional one before we have even begun. Here is the detail that shapes everything else about Vlad's psychology and his subsequent behaviour, and pay attention, because this is the specific biographical fact that makes his actions not merely extreme but comprehensible in a way that pure sadism never is. In 1442, when Vlad was approximately 14 years old, his father, Vlad Dracula, sent him and his younger brother Radu to the Ottoman court as political hostages, a common diplomatic practice of the period by which princes guaranteed their loyalty to the Sultan by placing their children in Ottoman custody, children who would be treated well as long as the father cooperated and would be killed or worse if he did not. The years Vlad spent as an Ottoman hostage, probably from approximately 1442 to 1448. The exact dates debated by historians were not, by the standards of the Ottoman court, brutal, but they were psychologically formative, in ways that the historical record makes clear even without direct documentary evidence of his inner life, because a boy who was sent to a foreign court as a guarantee of his father's good behaviour, who watched his brother Radu gradually accommodate himself to Ottoman culture and become a favourite of the Sultan's household, while he himself maintained a resistance that kept him in a more restricted form of custody, who learned at the age of 17 that his father had been assassinated by Wallachian boyars and that his older brother Mircea had been buried alive by their enemies. That boy was going to emerge from the Ottoman court with a specific and permanent understanding of what loyalty and betrayal actually cost that no amount of conventional princely education could have produced. Stop here, because the brother detail is the one that changes the entire moral landscape of what Vlad did later, and most accounts of his life pass over it too quickly. Vlad's older brother Mircea was not merely killed by the Wallachian boyars who opposed his father. He was buried alive, apparently while still conscious. A fate so specific and so documented that it sits in the historical record as the specific personal context within which Vlad's subsequent treatment of boyars needs to be understood, not excused, not justified, but understood, because a man who buries people alive is a different kind of threat from a man who kills quickly and Vlad knew this from the age of 17 in the most personal and irreversible way possible. Vlad's first reign as Prince of Wallachia in 1448 lasted approximately 2 months before he was driven out by Ottoman-backed rivals, a humiliation so complete and so swift that it required a full 8 years of manoeuvring, alliance building, and Hungarian military support before he could return to his throne in 1456 for his second reign, the reign that would last 6 years and produce the specific acts that made him the most feared ruler in Eastern Europe, a reign that began not with a diplomatic reception or a coronation banquet, but with an action so precisely calibrated and so theatrically deliberate that it announced immediately and without ambiguity what kind of Prince Wallachia now had. The Easter Sunday feast of 1457, and this is the moment where history and legend become almost impossible to separate. But the core of what happened is documented. In multiple independent sources, Vlad invited the Wallachian boyar families who had been responsible for or complicit in the deaths of his father and brother to a celebratory feast, allowed them to eat and drink in what they believed was a gesture of reconciliation, and then at a signal had his soldiers surround the hall, arrest every boyar present with their families, march the older men and women directly to impalement stakes that had already been prepared outside the city, and set the younger and stronger members of the families to work in chains building the castle at Poenari that would become his primary fortress, a castle built entirely by boyar slave labour that was, by the time it was finished, a monument to exactly the kind of power that does not negotiate. Now here is the detail about impalement that most accounts of Vlad skip over because it is genuinely difficult to write about clearly, and stay with this because understanding the specific mechanics is essential to understanding why the Ottoman army reacted the way it did when they saw it done at scale. Impalement, as Vlad practiced, it was not the rapid death it sounds like. It was a prolonged process specifically designed to keep the victim alive and conscious for hours or sometimes days. The stake inserted in a way that avoided immediately vital organs, the body supported so that its own weight did not drive the stake further in quickly. The entire construction, engineered not for efficient killing, but for maximum duration of suffering and maximum visual impact on anyone who had to walk past it, which is why Romanian accounts of Vlad's impalement forests describe people still alive on stakes after hours, and why Turkish sources describe the psychological effect on Ottoman soldiers in specific terms of horror rather than mere disgust. The specific acts of Vlad's second reign that the historical sources document with the most consistency include the impalement of Saxon merchants from Transylvania, who he accused of trade violations, approximately 30,000 people killed during his reign, by various accounts. A number historians debate but treat as representing genuine mass killing at a scale unusual even by the standards of the period, the nailing of turbans to the heads of Ottoman envoys who refused to remove them citing religious custom, which was either a genuine act of contempt or a deliberate provocation, designed to force the Ottoman response he needed to justify his military actions, depending on which historian you read and how charitable they are feeling towards their subject. Here's the hook that almost no Vlad documentary ever reaches, and it is the most important single detail in his entire story, the specific reason Mehmed II, the man who had conquered Constantinople with the largest cannon ever built, and who had personally directed the siege that ended 1,000 years of Byzantine civilization, turned his army around outside Târgoviște in 1462 without a major engagement, was not tactical caution or logistical difficulty. It was the specific sight that greeted his advance forces when they reached the area outside the city, a forest of impaled bodies, approximately 20,000 Ottoman soldiers, and prisoners staked in the ground across the landscape, the largest single act of psychological warfare in the medieval period, a message so specific and so deliberately constructed that Mehmed II, a man who had watched thousands of people die without flinching, reportedly wept when he saw it, and acknowledged that a man capable of this could not be opposed in his own territory. The specific number and arrangement of Vlad's Forest of the Impaled, recorded by multiple independent sources including Ottoman chronicles, Saxon accounts, and the reports of the Wallachian court, varied between sources in their specific figures, but were consistent in describing an installation so vast and so deliberately theatrical that it extended for miles outside the city, with the stakes arranged in concentric circles of increasing density toward the center, the bodies in various stages of decomposition, creating a landscape that combined the visual impact of mass death with the specific smell and atmospheric quality of an abattoir at industrial scale, a sensory experience so total that even soldiers who had been on campaigns for decades and had seen the aftermath of major battles described it in their chronicles with a quality of disturbed attention that sets it apart from routine military violence. Stay with this, because here is the specific Ottoman account that proves Mehmed's reaction was genuine and not propaganda. The Turkish historian Tursun Beg, who was actually present with Mehmed's army at Târgoviște in 1462, recorded that when the Sultan saw the forest of impaled bodies, he said, in a formulation that's been quoted in histories of the period for 5 centuries, that a man who had done such things to his own subjects as well as to his enemies deserved to rule a great empire. A quote whose ambiguity, half admiration, half horror, captures more precisely than any academic analysis the specific quality of Vlad's psychological impact on the people who encountered his work. The relationship between Vlad and his younger brother Radu is one of the most psychologically complex and least covered aspects of his entire story. The same 2 boys who sat in the same Ottoman court as hostages for 6 years, who received the same education and were exposed to the same cultural influences, who watched the same things happen to their family from the same distance, and who emerged from that shared experience as completely opposite political figures. Vlad, the implacable enemy of the Ottoman power that held him. Radu, the willing collaborator who converted to Islam and became Mehmed's personal favourite. And when Mehmed's army retreated from Târgoviște, it was Radu that Mehmed sent back with a smaller force, banking on the specific insight that a man who could resist the entire Ottoman army might not be able to resist his own brother leading a campaign against him. Radu's campaign worked, and this is the part of the story that history always presents as Vlad's military defeat, but that is more accurately understood as a social collapse. Because the reason Vlad could not maintain his position against his brother's forces was not that Radu was a better general, or that the Ottoman forces were overwhelming. It was that the Wallachian boyars, who had been living in terror of Vlad's discipline for 6 years, took the opportunity of the Ottoman advance to defect to Radu in numbers large enough to make Vlad's position untenable, which tells you something important about the specific failure of governance by terror. It works until it faces a credible alternative, at which point everyone who has been waiting for that alternative moves toward it simultaneously. Vlad fled to Hungary in 1462 and was promptly imprisoned by King Matthias Corvinus. His supposed ally, the man whose military support had helped him take his throne in 1456, in a move so politically cynical that historians have debated its justification ever since, with the most plausible explanation being that Matthias had received substantial funds from Pope Pius II, specifically to support a crusade against the Ottomans, and had spent the money on other things, and that imprisoning Vlad and producing forged letters suggesting he had been negotiating with the Ottomans provided a convenient explanation for why the crusade had not happened. That redirected attention from Matthias's own financial irregularities. The 12 years Vlad spent imprisoned in Hungary from approximately 1462 to 1474 are documented in the historical record primarily through the lens of the stories that circulated about his behaviour in captivity. Most famously the account that he caught mice and small birds and impaled them on tiny stakes in his cell. A detail that reads either as psychological truth about a man whose compulsions were so deep they expressed themselves even in the most constrained circumstances, or as propaganda designed to establish his madness, but which has been repeated in virtually every account of his life since the 15th century, because it captures something about Vlad's character that is both entirely plausible and entirely unforgettable. Here is the detail that the Bram Stoker connection obscures rather than illuminates, and this is crucial for understanding why the real Vlad is more disturbing than the fictional one. Stoker's Dracula is a creature of the night, a predator who hunts individuals in secret. whose power depends on darkness and concealment and the victim's ignorance of what is happening to them, while the historical Vlad's entire operational logic was the exact opposite. His punishments were public, his executions were theatrical, his forests of impaled bodies were designed to be seen from a distance by the maximum number of people, and his power depended not on secrecy, but on total transparency, on everyone knowing exactly what he was doing and exactly what it meant to cross him. The specific accounts of Vlad's punishments that German pamphlets began circulating in the 1460s and 1470s. Some of the earliest examples of printed political propaganda in European history, produced in part by the Saxon merchants of Transylvania, whose economic interests Vlad had damaged, described him boiling people alive, skinning them, cutting off limbs, forcing family members to eat each other, and various other acts of extreme violence that modern historians treat with significant skepticism. Not because Vlad was incapable of extreme violence, the historical record of his impalement campaigns establishes that beyond any serious doubt, but because the Saxon sources had specific financial and political reasons to exaggerate his cruelty, and because several of the specific acts described appear in almost identical form in earlier anti-tyranny literature as generic accusations against bad rulers rather than specific reports of observed events. Vlad's third and final reign in 1476 lasted approximately 2 months before he was killed, the exact circumstances of his death as disputed as almost everything else about him, with some sources claiming he was killed in battle against the Ottomans, others suggesting assassination by boyars, one account describing him being killed by his own men, who mistook him for an enemy in the chaos of a skirmish, and Mehmed II reportedly receiving his head in Constantinople, where it was displayed on a stake. A final irony that the man who had made impalement into an art form of political communication ended his life as a message sent by his enemies through exactly the same medium. What Bram Stoker actually knew about the historical Vlad the Impaler is less than most people assumed. Stoker's research notes, which survive and have been studied by scholars, show that he encountered the name Dracula in a book about Wallachian history by William Wilkinson published in 1820, that he noted the name meant devil in the Wallachian language, which is not quite accurate as we have already established, and that he incorporated the name and the general sense of a Transylvanian ruler associated with darkness and violence into what was primarily a Gothic horror novel drawing on much older vampire mythology from across Eastern Europe, meaning that the connection between the fictional Dracula and the historical Vlad is substantially thinner and more indirect than the popular association suggests. The legacy of Vlad the Impaler is one of the most genuinely divided in European historical memory. In Romania, he is regarded not primarily as a monster, but as a national hero, a ruler who defended Wallachian independence against the most powerful empire in the world through methods that were extreme, but that need to be understood in the context of an existential military threat that had already consumed every neighbouring kingdom it had encountered. And Romanian historians have consistently pointed out that the most extreme accounts of his cruelty come from sources Saxon merchants and Ottoman chronicles, with direct political and military reasons to present him in the worst possible light, while the Romanian folk tradition preserves a ruler who was severe but just, who punished corruption, who made the roads safe, and who did to his enemies exactly what his enemies would have done to him. What Vlad the Impaler represents in the history of political violence, and this is the conclusion that every serious historian who has examined the evidence eventually reaches, regardless of their moral assessment of the man, is not the simple horror of a sadist who happened to acquire political power, but the specific and recurring historical phenomenon of a ruler in an impossible strategic position who chose to solve the problem of inspiring sufficient fear in his enemies to deter them through methods so extreme that they crossed from military strategy into something that sits in a different moral category. A man who understood with complete clarity that in the specific world he inhabited, being feared was the only reliable substitute for being strong, and who pursued that specific goal with an intelligence and a consistency and a theatrical sophistication that made him uniquely effective for exactly as long as the fear held, and uniquely vulnerable the moment it didn't. And if that specific kind of historical figure, the man who was genuinely effective, genuinely strategic, genuinely more complicated than the monster his enemies made him into, and genuinely more extreme than the hero his own people needed him to be, if that is the kind of history that makes you stop and think about what it actually means to govern in the face of an existential threat, then you already know what this channel's for, and you already know there are more stories like this one waiting. Rulers more complex than Vlad, situations more impossible, methods more extreme and more rationally explicable than anything a horror novel could invent. And those are the stories we tell here in full, without softening, and without the comfort of simple judgments.